So the most recent book I read is called The Resurrection of Jesus, A New Historiographical Approach, and it's by a biblical scholar named Michael Licona. I wanted to read this because I'm familiar with Michael Licona. He has debated some well-known skeptical scholars such as Bart Ehrman, and I really appreciate his kind of tone and attitude about the resurrection, specifically because he is an affirming scholar. He affirms the resurrection as a Christian scholar, but he does seem a lot more humble and willing to accept new information. He seems more open to being proven wrong. And so I think that's a good attitude to have. He's not an apologist. He is a biblical scholar and historian. And I just think that he's a little bit different from a lot of apologists that address this issue. He does start out the book by establishing his own bias, and I think this is commendable. I think, as he said, this needs to happen a lot more often and more clearly in biblical scholarship, or really just scholarship in general. And so he states that he has always been a Christian. He hasn't changed his fundamental position in terms of his faith. He does want this to be true, but he does his very best to try to put aside his biases and his religious perspective and approach the issue like a historian. Now, as commendable as this is, I did almost stop reading here because considering his conclusion is that the resurrection is historically literal, it does unfortunately taint his conclusions overall. Now, of course, it's important to hear out the evidence and every perspective, so I did continue, but I do think that it's really important to take what he says with a grain of salt by his own admission, because he hasn't changed his position on this at all. I personally tend to trust scholars who have changed their position on things. It doesn't make them correct, but it does speak to more of an intellectual honesty. But that's what Michael Licona tries to do here. He tries to be intellectually honest in approaching the evidence as any historian would. So he does a couple of things to start out. He discusses sort of the philosophy of history and this epistemological question, that is, what can we know and how can we know it? How can we know what we know? This is a hard question, and so there are various ways that historians have attempted to address it and determine what historically is true and what events have happened and maybe what hasn't. And so he talks about the way that they establish sort of an objective standard. This is an attempt to communicate with similar language what is more likely or less likely to have happened in history. So they use terms like this event was almost certainly, it almost certainly happened, or that event is absolutely unlikely, things like this. So he discusses this sort of standard, and he uses the language of that standard to assess the evidence as he goes about the rest of the text. The other thing that he does is he makes it clear the value and the importance of scholarly consensus. And scholars don't agree 100% on anything, of course, but there are a variety of things that they can have a consensus on. As it relates to the resurrection, he establishes that there are 3 historical bedrock facts that are virtually universally agreed upon by scholars. And those 3 facts are: 1, Jesus lived and died by crucifixion. 2, Jesus' disciples, soon after his death, had some experiences that compelled them to proclaim the resurrection, whatever that means, and to live out this emerging community of the way as followers of Jesus. And then the third thing is the conversion of Paul, who was apparently persecuting Christians on some level, but then changed his whole worldview and became one of the leading proponents of this new thing called Christianity. Licona also discusses some texts that we use to identify these facts. He talks about other things within these texts that are used within the argument, but he is clear that these three are the only ones that are virtually universally agreed upon. So, ultimately, based on these things, a couple other things, and some of the text that he evaluates to be reliable, he comes to some other perspectives, some ideas from scholars that suggest the resurrection did not happen, and they provide some reasons for it. He discusses a few alternative ideas. And he goes through systematically and shows why each of these are not valid, why the reasoning and why the conclusions are not valid in terms of this objective standard that he has not established himself, but that historians tend to use. And so the problem with this, of course, is he, coming from his perspective, is the one that's making judgments. He uses the standard, but he is making certain judgments in relation to these other views. And because of his own bias, right, he is going to come out with the conclusions that more align with his bias, more likely. It doesn't matter how intellectually honest a person attempts to be, this influence is undeniable. It's really hard to get away from it. It takes a lot of practice and a great intentionality. But anyway, by his view, the alternative perspectives don't work out, and the most valid and compelling reason for these bedrock facts that we have is the resurrection hypothesis, as he calls it. So that's essentially the whole text is him going through all of that. He goes into these things in great detail. He comes out with his conclusion that the resurrection is historically accurate. And ultimately, again, we just have to take this with a grain of salt, because for every historian who's making these judgments, their own biases are influencing the decisions that they make in drawing conclusions, what they believe to be reliable or valid or not. So I would say, in terms of an approach, a historical approach to the resurrection, this is pretty good. One of the best. Again, I really appreciate Michael Licona's attitude, and I think that he does a good job with with presenting the evidence and describing the data in detail. I think foundationally there are probably some philosophical perspectives that we would differ on, which would ultimately lead us probably to conclude different things about the evidence that is available. But he is on par with some of the best scholars that have approached this. And the last thing that he actually does in his book is discuss Dale Allison's view on the resurrection, which I highly recommend you looking into. Anybody should look into this argument or this discussion, because Dale Allison, while he is a professing Christian, he is somewhat agnostic about whether or not the resurrection happened. And his book might be my favorite text about the subject because it's extremely thorough and balanced. Ultimately, though, this is a good book. It makes one aware of a lot of the scholarship and a lot of the ideas that are pretty mainstream in investigating this topic. So I would recommend it. Again, whether you're somebody who agrees with Michael Licona or disagrees with Michael Licona, it's important to hear the argument from the perspective of somebody who is an affirming resurrection scholar. But overall, really well done. So go ahead and give it a try and enjoy it.